Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first little mini lecture. So, this one's on chapter three, which is dealing with psychology ethics. And so, what I do in the mini lectures is I just have your textbook here on my screen that hopefully you're able to see as well. And I just have some things highlighted that I thought, either needed further explanation or just wanted to highlight it because it's important for a quiz or just something that I want to talk about. So, by all means, this mini lecture does not replace you actually reading through the chapter. Again, it's just meant as kind of a way to make the online class feel a little bit more complete and also just give you some more information than perhaps what your textbook has. So, um, this one's broken up into kind of three subsections. The third one, to be quite honest, I'm not going to really talk at all about, um, just because it's very applied to what I'll be talking about beforehand. So, first and foremost, the moral foundations of ethics. So, I think it's important to understand what the definition of ethics actually is. So, as your text has it highlighted, ethics is a branch of philosophy that is concerned with morality, what it means to behave morally, and how people can achieve that goal. So, in psychology, we throw the term ethics around pretty loosely, to be quite frank. And in part, that's because we recognize our history is not great. We have violated a lot of ethics, human ethics, animal ethics, throughout, the history of psychology. We've really started to focus in, honestly, within like the last 50-ish years about what is ethical research. But prior to that, we were kind of just in this free range of, if we want to do it and it sounds good to the primary researcher, you're good. And now we go through many more protocols, which you're going to see highlighted here. So, um, this table, I don't have anything highlighted in it, but it is essentially your quiz. So question 2 of your quiz asks you to kind of look at each one of these different cells and highlight, and describe different things about them. So just in case you're wondering, where did that table come from? It came from your textbook, and I thought it was very good to think about it, because far too often we think of research and just the participants, and that's the only kind of ethical thing that we focus on. But by all means, we have these other two very broad branches that need to be considered as well. So, weighing risks against benefits. Um, Ultimately, we can only be ethical if we can minimize the risks. Now, almost every single psychology research study is going to have some degree of risk. Um, Sometimes it's going to be blatant that you're causing physical harm to somebody or you're asking them to relive a traumatizing event. Other times it might be much more subtle that, you know 90-95% of your participants won't have any issue whatsoever, but then that last 5 to 10%, it triggers something in them, that they ultimately experience psychological distress, even just, a little bit of discomfort is still considered a risk. Um, so we want to do our best to kind of minimize those things and ensure that we are keeping, our participants' rights, from being violated and whatnot. Um, a risk. So those are risks to, participants. Risk to science is that the research is uninteresting or poorly designed. I just really enjoy the way the textbook phrases that. That absolutely, when we look at science as a whole, and psychology is considered a science, we use a scientific method. We need to ensure that we are doing right by the field and putting together things that are actually worthwhile. Um, it also mentions in there time, money, and effort. That absolutely, when we value, you know, our time, that one's the one that's kind of a little like, it's kind of your fault as a researcher for designing something poorly or for studying something that's not interesting. But the money side of things, absolutely. That there's certainly grants that psychologists can get, but kind of outside of that, universities, colleges are funding the time spent on the research. Um, when we look at major universities that are considered research one, shorthand R1, it means that they are pumping out fantastic research. So most of the big universities that you can think of, they're going to be what's considered R1. And so in those institutes, typically faculty will teach, 2 or 3 courses a semester, and that is it. And the rest of their time is supposed to be doing research, right? So when we look at their salaries are being paid for, minimum time spent in the classroom, maximum time spent in the lab doing research and things like that. And so again, if you're doing just nonsensical things, if you are designing research that just is, bad, then it is a waste of the university's money, which ultimately kind of ends up being the state's money, since a lot of universities are state funded. So that ultimately hampers science, and it prevents science from moving forward and progressing. And then risk of society, results could be misunderstood or misapplied with harmful consequences. They mentioned the idea of vaccinations causing autism. There was a study that showed that in 1994. Researcher's name was Andrew Wakefield. And at the end of the day, he misrepresented his data. Once some digging around happened, they found out that he had actually invested a substantial amount of money into a company to develop an alternative to the MMR vaccine. And obviously that leads to kind of this, I'm blanking on the term, but where you probably are going to be extremely biased, that if you have invested a lot of money into something, and then you're doing research on the competition, essentially, you're likely to kind of skew your data, and that's exactly what happened. The article that was published was ultimately retracted, a few months later, and he was blacklisted from the research community. But this is part of the problem, is that many people still believe this to be somewhat factual, if not completely factual, despite all the evidence going against it, because the study is out there. You can certainly find other people that think that it does show a link when it actually doesn't, and then they go find other poorly done research, and it just kind of creates this massive vortex. And so that is absolutely a problem or a risk to society. Here, the textbook goes into the Milgram study, which, if you've taken a social psychology class, Milgram study most likely was heavily discussed in that class. If you haven't, just the general quick gist of it is that Milgram wanted to see how far people will go to obey an authority figure. And so he set up a situation where participants would sign up to do this research. They were paid, I forget if it was $10 or $15. No, sorry, I think it was $4 in this one. 1963, $4, pretty decent amount. And they were told, all right, we're going to be testing essentially positive punishment on your ability to learn. So the idea was that one person was going to be a teacher, the other person was going to be a learner. The learner had to memorize a list of word pairs, and once they thought they had it memorized, they would start to study. And the teacher would ultimately say one of the word pairs. The learner then had to press a button corresponding to the correct answer. If the learner got it wrong, the teacher gave them a shock. and it started at 15 volts and then went up in 15-volt increments all the way up to 450. So the idea here was that eventually the teacher would want to stop, right? That there'd be some type of fiasco going on. Typically, it was the learner saying, I have a heart condition, the shocks are bothering my heart, I want to leave the study, I want this to stop. And so the teacher, would typically pause and look at the researcher, who was a guy in a lab coat. And the researcher had 4 different prompts that he could tell the teacher. And it was nothing threatening. It was just, the study must go on. It's imperative that you must go on. You have no other choice but to go on. But there was no threats, just statements like that. So what Milgram found in this study is that about 68% of the participants went all the way up to 450 volts, despite the learner asking to leave the study, begging to leave. If you ever want to look more detail, there's tons of stuff out there. The little twist to this particular study, though, is that the learner, the guy that was supposedly being shocked, was actually what we call a Confederate, meaning that he was in on the study. He was a friend of the researcher and was not actually being shocked. All the responses were tape recorded, but the teacher didn't know that. The teacher was the real participant to kind of see how this goes. And it brought up a bunch of ethical considerations, right? Is this ethical to think that, or to let your participant think that they killed somebody, because many of them did think that they actually killed the person in the other room? Is it ethical to ultimately lie about the main purpose of it, which we call deception? Again, tons and tons of different concerns about this were brought up both when the study was being done and then certainly afterwards. So it's a great study to look at when we look at ethics and what should we be doing versus what shouldn't we be doing. Was Milgram's study worth it? Because we certainly know individuals had, mental breakdowns and were under extreme stress. Based upon what we found out, was that a good enough benefit to the risks with that study? Some people argue yes, some people argue no, and it's one of those things that everybody has their right to have their opinion, because it certainly is a gray area when we look at ethics. Acting responsibly and with integrity, participants must be able to trust that researchers are being honest with them, will keep their promises, and will carry out their research in ways that maximize benefits and minimize risk. Important issue here is the use of deception. So absolutely, if participants are doubtful of the researcher, do not have trust in the researcher, especially in psychology, odds are the results are going to be skewed, because the participant's going to be acting differently than how they typically would, right? We hopefully can get participants to act as natural as possible so we can actually study true human behavior. When we do things in the study that ultimately switch what a participant is likely to be doing, that becomes a problem in its own right. So one of the best ways to kind of safeguard against that is to present yourself as having integrity and, calmly walking the participant through everything that's going to be done. Now, there are times that deception needs to be used. Deception in its own right is not a terrible thing, but certainly it needs to be used in the right conditions. We should not just deceive participants to deceive. There has to be a justification for using deception. Deception just means that you tell your participants one thing and you actually do something else. So whether that is you tell them that you're going to be studying some aspect, but you're actually studying something else, whether that's you lie about the scenario. In some of my research, I have had to tell participants that, a sexual assault again, just to highlight what my research is before I share, typically it's on extra legal factors with sexual assaults. So there's been times that I've had to tell a group of students to make it more personal that a sexual assault happened on campus. And then once, the study was done, I would tell them, all right, so that particular case did not actually happen on campus. It was fabricated to get a more connected response to this scenario. Um, Sometimes I will have to make up cases as well, which then again at the very end I will tell them that case was fictional and here's the reasons why it was created. Things like that, to where I deceive them about the nature of what they were being tested on. Um, and so again, sometimes it is necessary. If it is, it's fine to use. Just make sure that you kind of safeguard yourself on the back end, which we'll be talking about debriefing in a little bit. But absolutely, if we don't need to use deception, we shouldn't, because it allows us to have more integrity at the end of the day. So seeking justice, there's the Tuskegee syphilis study mentioned here. Just wanted to highlight it because it's an extremely important study that plays a role in how we now understand ethics. Again, we're going to try to shorthand it here, but essentially it started in 1932, before civil rights movement that kind of finished up 1968. And kind of 68 was when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. I think the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 1964. So we're about 32 years out from the civil rights movement happening in the US. And so the US Public Health Service wanted to better understand syphilis. So they went to very rural, very poor African American neighborhoods and said, we are offering free health care, essentially, that you get physicals and all that stuff free of cost. Essentially, those that were diagnosed with syphilis, they were told that they had quote unquote bad blood, and these checkups would help treat it. Well, that was all a lie. Ultimately, again, bad blood's not a real medical condition, and we knew that in 1932. But what would happen is that penicillin became the standard use to treat syphilis in the 1940s. So 1940s, this is discovered penicillin actually treats syphilis very well. So there's really no point in studying the effects of syphilis anymore, since we now have essentially a cure for it. But the study went on for 30-ish years before it finally came to a stop. And the only reason it came to a stop was because journalists started to discover these documents and figure out what the US government was doing. So ultimately, extremely, extremely unethical that we withheld treatment from individuals, in addition to lying to individuals about what the purpose of the study was. And so it actually created what's known as the Belmont Report, which again, you'll see here in a little bit. But this is the integrity stuff that, again, we have to be sure that we're doing our best at. Otherwise, how do you ever get trust of participants? So here's that. Respecting people's rights and dignity. Autonomy, very important, right to make their own choices and take their own actions free from coercion. This is one of the reasons why vulnerable populations, so children, prisoners, elderly, they ultimately need to subject themselves to the research. Kids can't. Their parents can sign informed consents, and we still can study children, obviously, but we have to be very careful about the way we do it. Prisoners can sign up for research as well, but again, we can't force them to, because it would take away their autonomy. They need to be able to say, yes, I freely choose to participate, or no, I don't want to participate, and there cannot be punishment against them for doing so. So that's section 1 of the chapter. Section 2, moral principles to ethical codes. So as somebody that was trained to do research, again, my degree is in experimental psychology, I really enjoy the history of how did we get to where we're currently at. I do recognize many people will find that extremely dull and boring, but I do appreciate that they add in a little historical overview. I have nothing highlighted in here, but again, if you want to know like why is it so important, you can read about numerous cruel incidences that happen. So Nuremberg Code happened after Nazi Germany, and all the research that they were doing in the concentration camps. And I'll put research in air quotes because we now know most of the research or the scientific gains that were talked about for a long time from Nazi Germany weren't that great. There's numerous reports that have now kind of been able to backtrack and be like, no, they didn't actually find much of anything despite what they were doing to people. And certainly they're not advanced science, but we have the Nuremberg Code now that kind of was because of Nazi Germany, Belmont Report because of the Tuskegee syphilis study, and we now have something known as institutional review boards, or the IRB for short. If you take experimental psychology, and actually if you take it and I'm the instructor of it, you will ultimately have to go through the IRB to run your study that you propose. Institutional review boards, they ultimately make sure that you are following ethical guidelines. So certainly as an expert in the field, you are expected to know the ethical guidelines. But again, we all can be subject to biases that we might think this is fine because I really want to know the answer. The IRB is an independent review board from you. So they are the ones who are actually making sure that you're not running into ethical problems. Now, certainly you will have some disagreements at times with the IRB. It's to be expected, but that is their main goal, is to ensure that all ethics are being met. So this chunk here just highlights exempt research and minimal risk research. Exempt research would be if you've ever taken part in a study for educational activities. It typically means that it does not actually go through the IRB. Minimal risk, this is where the IRB kind of has the easiest one. It's known as kind of an expedited review, meaning that it doesn't have to go through a full board. Full board reviews, you actually go to the IRB and they ask you questions and you defend, why you're doing the study. Most of the research that I have done have fallen under the minimal risks. I've gone through a full review once, and honestly, it was more so for practice than anything else. But certainly, full board reviews are a thing that, depending upon what you are studying and how you're studying it, it might be a common part of your research life, or it might be something you rarely, if ever, do. All right, and then the ethics code. So this is taken from the ethics code. You can look it up, and I'll actually put the ethics code on Canvas for anybody that wants to look through it. But it is part of what the expectation of conducting research is. The book kind of lists out APA style, and then it goes into just simple details. I'm just going to highlight very briefly each one of these. So informed consent, this is what you have to get from your participants for them to actually go through the study. Most of the time we try to get informed consent before the study starts. If you're doing something like field research, it's a little bit difficult to get informed consent beforehand, so you try to get it afterwards. But informed consent should inform the participant kind of what is going to be happening in the study, the amount of time it's going to take, what are the risks associated with the study, what's the compensation as well. So many studies will pay participants. Most of them that are being done at the university level, it's going to be granting participants extra credit, but it will state it in there. Deception, talked a fair amount about that already. Here's just more details. Again, something that absolutely you can use, but we don't want to overdo it. We want to use deception when it is absolutely necessary. Debriefing. So this happens at the end of the study where you ultimately just have a discussion with your participants. If you're doing survey-based study, it's essentially kind of the last thing that they will see in the survey. And it just tells them what was the purpose of the study, what are contact numbers if they are experiencing any distress or trauma or anything like that. If they're actually in the lab and you're having them go through it, you tell them what the point of it was, give them your contact information so they can contact you for the full results of the study, things like that. Non-human animal subjects, we do have a section for those as well because we still do animal research. This is very much in the behavioralist realm. Certainly other areas will do animal research as well, but it is, most people think of behavioralist when they think of animal research in psychology. So working with mice and pigeons and whatnot. But absolutely, we need to make sure that we're still handling animals in an ethical fashion. Scholarly integrity, this just means that you're not lying, which sounds silly, but absolutely it happens every single year. There's a high profile researcher that is discovered to be fabricating data, so they're just making up numbers to support hypotheses. Plagiarism as well, it's always a concern at any level of academia, but yes, professionals plagiarize also. And so that's obviously a big no-no. All right, and then the last section, which again, I'm not going to go into much detail at all. It really is just kind of a review of the other two, just in a much more applied way. So this is like when you're ready to conduct a study, what are the steps that you're supposed to be taking, supposed to be considering. So it talks about, again, deception and integrity and what's ethical, but it's just in a much more like hands-on descriptive way. And this class for the most part is more theoretical. The experimental psychology class, if you end up taking it, that's the applied one where this stuff would be considered much more closely. But again, for purposes of this one, and my goal with these videos is try to make them like around 30 minutes, not anything more. So yeah, just nothing new in this section to really highlight. So that's it for this mini lecture on chapter 3. As always, if you have any questions about anything, please do not hesitate to ask. And yeah, hopefully you enjoyed it.